In my audiobook on Quine, it is proved that not all truths are learned through sensory observation, and it is also proved that without knowledge of such non-observational truths, we could not organize our knowledge, and we therefore could not understand the world, scientifically or otherwise. In the following section from the audiobook itself, professionally narrated by A. Zenz, some of the more important elements of my proof of this profound truth are stated.
Why NT is a broken argument. All knowledge of the spatio-temporal world is rooted in observation, but there's more to doing science than making observations. The observations are only a means to an end, the end being the acquisition of theoretical knowledge. We'll now see that non-observational knowledge is a precondition for theoretical knowledge, and also that it is always necessary truths that are known non-observationally. Our senses give us raw data. Raw data is the foundation of all empirical knowledge, but data cannot interpret itself. And even if it could, it wouldn't relieve you of the burden of having to interpret the data for yourself. For argument's sake, suppose that the data were self-interpreting, and that its self-interpretations were disclosed to you in periodic reports. Any such report would itself be given to you in terms of raw data that you'd have to analyze. So you couldn't even understand the report unless you already knew how to interpret the data. Second, once you did understand the report, you'd have no good reason to trust it unless you could find some independent corroboration for it. Finding such corroboration would involve coming up with your own interpretation of the data and seeing how well it matched the interpretation in the report. So even if, per impossible, perceptual data could self-interpret, one could learn nothing about the external world from those interpretations unless one could interpret the data for oneself. It is, therefore, totally incoherent to suppose that one could know on the basis of observation alone how to interpret the data of observation. And since it's totally incoherent to suppose that one could have theoretical or therefore scientific knowledge without interpreting the data, it is totally incoherent to suppose that any science could be strictly observation-based. There is necessarily a non-observational component to the acquisition of scientific knowledge. Interpreting data involves being able to discern abstract resemblances between different concrete situations. Doing this, in its turn, involves knowing necessary truths. Seeing that two objects are alike in respect of, example, their shape, involves seeing that they fulfill conditions that, if not fulfilled by an object, necessarily preclude it from having the shape in question. Seeing that otherwise dissimilar objects, x and y, are both square-shaped involves knowing that were an object to have more sides than x or y, it would, for that very reason, fail to have the same shape as them, and it also involves knowing that if an object had a different color from x or y, it would not, for that very reason, fail to have the same shape as them. One can't know that x and y have the same shape unless one knows that an object's having four sides necessarily disqualifies it from being shape identical with those objects. In general, one cannot discern any abstract similarities between any two concrete situations unless one knows, for at least some property, what conditions must be fulfilled if a given object is to have that property. So knowledge of necessary truths is a precondition for being able to recognize resemblances between things. Since knowledge of such resemblances is the first and the most rudimentary phase of scientific endeavor, it is radically incoherent to suppose that there should be any scientific knowledge without knowledge of at least some necessary truths. W.V.O. Quine tried to provide a rigorous proof of NT. We have examined this proof and found it to be wanting. But notice that the very idea of trying to prove that contention is a self-defeating one. For there are no proofs if all truth is contingent, since proving something is showing that it must be the case. More accurately, to prove conclusion C on the basis of premises P is to show it to be necessarily true that if P, then C. Thus, to prove NN to be true is to prove it to be false. So a certain incoherence is embedded in the very idea of trying to show that there are no necessary statements.